Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right? Therapy, meditation, conversations, reading, yet the anguish lingers, lurking, silent, circling you when no one's watching? Have you ever wondered why, despite all the information about mental health, you still feel so lost inside? Maybe the issue isn't a lack of help. Maybe what's missing is a philosophy, a foundation, a path that brings you back to yourself. This video is a bold and uncomfortable invitation to look at pain from a different angle. Not as a trauma to be analyzed, but as a symptom of a directionless mind. Because the truth is this: therapy can listen to you, but only Stoicism teaches you how to act. And right now, as you watch, you might be starting to realize that what you're missing isn't more talk. It's practice. Not just comfort, but discipline. Not only understanding, but a philosophy that gives you structure, silence, strength, and clarity. So stay until the end. Every word was chosen as if it were a breath in your chaos. We'll talk about truths that hurt but liberate, about secrets the ancients knew and modern psychology forgot, about a philosophy that can, yes, save your life. And if, by the end, something inside you shifts, write in the comments. The healing began when I stopped waiting for someone to save me. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep walking this path with us. Some truths are like broken mirrors. They reflect reality with cuts that sting, but show exactly what you need to see. And one of them, perhaps the most uncomfortable, is that therapy won't save you. It can guide, comfort, offer tools, but salvation, that's an inside job. This is where Stoicism comes in like a beacon in a starless night. Stoic philosophy doesn't offer the instant relief of a professional ear, but it delivers something even more valuable: emotional autonomy. Instead of teaching you to depend on a space, a therapist, or a diagnosis, it teaches you to be the space. A Stoic doesn't wait to be saved. They build themselves, slowly, with scars, but with strength. It's easy to place hope in others. That's why so many transfer the weight of their pain to the cushioned chair of a therapist's office. "I'm here to heal," they say. But what they don't realize is that no one can dive into the abyss within you for you. Therapy is a compass, but it's not the journey. And when someone grasps this, when they finally face that transformation demands action, practice, and mental discipline, everything changes. Stoicism doesn't ask you to talk about your pain. It invites you to observe it in silence and still move forward. It doesn't victimize you. It strengthens you. Because in the end, it's this: either you learn to master your emotions, or you'll be enslaved by them. This is the reality check many avoid, because the truth hurts. It hurts to admit you need to take full responsibility for your life, that no one will rescue you from what you're too afraid to face. Stoicism looks you in the eye and says you'll keep suffering until you stop expecting someone else to do it for you. And that, my friend, is freedom. A raw, unfiltered, transformative freedom. And maybe that's why it works so well, because while you wait for salvation, Stoicism hands you self-sufficiency. And that's just the first glimmer of light, because there's something deeper, a wound you might not even know you have. Have you ever considered that what you're feeling might not be a chemical problem, but a philosophical one? That maybe your anxiety isn't a disease, but a reflection of a mind without direction? Modern society loves to pathologize everything. Any discomfort becomes a diagnosis. Any sadness becomes a disorder. But what if, instead of a pill, what you need is a new code of thought? Stoicism, with its brutal simplicity, proposes something shocking. You're not broken. You've just learned to think the wrong way. Stoic philosophy doesn't soften pain with sweet words. It turns you inside out and asks, what's the lie you were taught about how to deal with life? From a young age, we're conditioned to flee discomfort, numb suffering, and seek external solutions for internal voids. No one teaches us to sit with unease. No one shows us that pain sometimes is a teacher shouting because we refuse to listen. Therapy, when misunderstood, can reinforce this cycle of avoidance. You go, you talk, you expect relief, and return to the same life with the same habits, thoughts, and patterns. Stoicism teaches something else. It shows that mental health often comes from mental discipline, that the chaos outside has no more power than the order within, as long as you learn to cultivate it. The problem isn't what happens to you, it's how you interpret it. And that, thankfully, can be relearned. You don't need a new label. You need a new operating system. One that doesn't rely on motivation but on virtue. One that doesn't seek relief but clarity. Stoicism delivers that. It doesn't infantilize you with promises of a magical cure. It shows you that your mind is malleable. That emotional freedom comes when you let go of the idea that you're sick and start acting like someone who can, and must, be their own therapist. Not with arrogance, but with autonomy. Because when you realize the world doesn't need to change for you to be okay, something in you awakens. A quiet peace, a new strength, and a hunger for everything that can still be rewired. There's something no therapist, no matter how skilled, can give you: mastery over yourself. They can listen, they can guide, but they can't live for you. They can't be there when your thoughts darken at 3 a.m. They can't stop that burst of anger or silence, the doubts that flood your mind in traffic, chaos, or solitude. But Stoicism can. Not as magic, but as practice, as mental discipline, as a living philosophy. It gives you a code, an inner armor. And the most powerful part? It hands you the reins of your own consciousness. What you were searching for outside was waiting to be awakened within you all along. Therapy can be the map, but Stoicism turns you into the compass. It doesn't answer for you. It teaches you to ask better questions. It doesn't judge you, but it doesn't spare you either. Because, unlike many modern approaches that treat the mind as fragile, Stoic philosophy reminds you that you're strong, that you're capable of crossing what seems impossible, that emotional control isn't a gift, it's a cultivated virtue, that stopping suffering doesn't depend on changing the world, but on changing the lens through which you see it. It's as if every morning Marcus Aurelius whispers in your ear, "You have power over your mind, not over events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And that's when everything starts to shift. Because when you accept that you can be your own safe harbor, fear loses its grip. You no longer despair when there's no one to talk to. You learn to listen to yourself, to comfort yourself, to discipline yourself, to guide yourself. This doesn't replace the value of therapeutic listening, but it fills a void that only daily practice can fill: the construction of an anti-fragile mindset. Stoicism brings you back to yourself, and in doing so, it activates something dormant, a hidden power, a kind of ancestral wisdom that isn't found in modern books, but shouts in the subtext of every cultivated silence. Not every pain needs to be called trauma. Not every deep discomfort is a scar from the past. Sometimes what you feel is just the echo of a life without direction, principles, or purpose. The absence of philosophy creates an existential void that the mind tries to fill with any narrative that seems to make sense, even if that narrative casts you as a victim. It's easier to say, "I am this way because of what I've been through," than to ask, "What can I do with this now?" Stoicism steps in right here. It doesn't let you hide behind the pain. It doesn't reduce you to a label. It invites you, without drama, to take the reins of your own story. Many spend years digging through memories trying to heal a pain that doesn't come from the past, but from a lack of structure in the present. And that's why so many get frustrated. Because the answer isn't always in revisiting. Sometimes it's in rebuilding, in relearning how to think. Stoic philosophy doesn't ask you to dig up wounds. It asks you to build virtues. And then the magic happens. By strengthening your present, the past loses its weight. because the suffering that keeps returning isn't always a real trauma, but a mind without direction, without an anchor, without a philosophy. When you lack a system of thought, any pain becomes an abyss. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. Maybe you're suffering not because of what happened, but because of how you learned to interpret the world. Maybe the problem isn't the experience, but the narrative you built around it. And as long as you stay trapped in that story, the suffering will keep repeating. Stoicism offers another path. It doesn't erase what you've lived through, but it gives you tools to reinterpret it with clarity, presence, and power. It doesn't heal with tears. It heals with lucidity. And in that transformative silence, you start to understand. What seemed like trauma might just have been the absence of a philosophy that teaches you to be free. There's a kind of peace that comes when you realize you don't have to react to everything. That it's not your duty to respond to every provocation, every sideways glance, every injustice that crosses your path. And more than that, the more you react, the more you're controlled. Stoicism understands this like no other. It doesn't teach you to be passive, but to be wise, to realize that true power lies in choosing how you behave, even when the world around you seems to crumble. A Stoic isn't defined by stimuli. They're defined by the response they choose to give. And that choice, friend, changes everything. Think about it. How many times have you been emotionally hijacked by something small, an ignored message, a snide comment, an unfair criticism? And how many times did that throw you off balance, rob you of sleep, steal your peace? It wasn't the other person who knocked you off center. It was your reaction to them. What Stoicism proposes is simple but powerful. Stop, breathe, observe, and only then, if necessary, act. Not as someone who explodes, but as someone who chooses. That's true mental discipline, resisting the temptation to be swept away by impulse. The world can be loud, chaotic, provocative, but you don't have to be an echo of that chaos. You can be a steady silence in the midst of the storm, and it's in that space between stimulus and response that freedom is born. The freedom to not be manipulated, to not get lost in emotional cycles, to not let the external dictate your internal. When you stop reacting, the world stops controlling you. People lose the power to hurt you. Circumstances lose the power to shake you, because the one who governs your mind is you. And that's when Stoic philosophy becomes more than a set of ideas. It becomes a way of life, a kind of presence, an invisible armor. But there's still something more that the ancients knew, and that modern psychology seems to have forgotten. Before there were therapy couches, there was silence. Before there were diagnoses, there was contemplation. Before the term mental health existed, there was the human desire for balance, clarity, and purpose. The ancients, like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, didn't have access to modern psychology manuals, but they carried something even more powerful, a philosophy that placed the responsibility for inner peace in the hands of the seeker. They knew that the mind, to be strong, needed to be trained like a muscle, with mental discipline, self-awareness, and virtue. And that wisdom has endured for centuries, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. Today, much of what we call progress in mental health is, in fact, distancing individuals from their own ability to guide themselves. We've replaced virtues with diagnoses, swapped daily practices for therapeutic jargon. Of course, psychology has its value, no one denies that. But the problem begins when it becomes a substitute for philosophy, when the focus shifts from personal growth to the endless analysis of what's missing. The Stoics, on the other hand, didn't get stuck on the why, they sought the what for. They didn't just want to understand the causes of suffering, they wanted to know what to do with it. And that's what many modern approaches forget. The mind isn't healed just with understanding, but with direction. Emotional relief is important, but transformation happens through practice, through habits, through the daily repetition of what's right, even when it hurts. The ancients understood that you can feel pain without becoming the pain, that you can have bad thoughts without being defined by them, that you can live in chaos and still maintain order within. They didn't call it coping, mindfulness, or resilience. They called it virtue. And maybe it's time to relearn that forgotten language. There's a kind of truth almost no one wants to hear, and even fewer want to pay to hear. Sometimes what's missing in your life isn't comfort, it's discipline. Not a new diagnosis, but routine. Not more talking, but more silence. And maybe that's why Stoicism, in its brutal simplicity, unsettles so many. It doesn't ask how you feel. It asks what you're doing with what you feel. It doesn't offer a symbolic hug, but a concrete responsibility, and that's where the shift happens. While therapy can help you understand why you suffer, Stoicism teaches you to act despite it. You can spend hours talking about what afflicts you and still keep living the same cycles. Because understanding isn't enough. You need to act, create structure, build habits, cultivate the strength to do what needs to be done even when you don't feel like it. This isn't inhumanity. It's practical wisdom. It's self-love in its most mature form. And this is where Stoicism surpasses many modern approaches. It understands that mental health isn't sustained by good intentions, but by consistent actions, by waking up and moving forward, even with fear, by choosing what's right, even with doubt, by not letting impulses rule you. The mental discipline Stoicism proposes isn't rigid, it's liberating. Because contrary to what many think, discipline doesn't trap you. It's what sets you free, free from your own saboteurs, free from emotional swings, free from self-deception. When you turn philosophy into practice, your mind starts to reprogram itself. And suddenly, you realize what healed you most wasn't talking about your problems. It was stopping feeding them with carelessness. It was the small daily act of choosing with intention. And that, no therapist can do for you. Some pains don't want to be explained. They want to be respected in silence. It's no use putting them into words, analyzing them, dissecting them, because they weren't born to be discussed, but to be crossed. And this is where Stoicism shines. While the modern world insists on verbalizing everything, the Stoic chooses silence, not out of cowardice, but wisdom. Because they understand there's a hidden power in the ability to not react, to not complain, to simply observe the internal movement. And it's in that transformative silence that the deepest layers of the mind reorganize. Mental discipline, in this case, isn't forced control. It's conscious surrender. A kind of surrender that doesn't weaken you, but renews you. Because when you stop fighting the pain, it stops fighting you. It's not about staying silent for the sake of silence. It's about listening to what can only be heard when everything quiets down. Stoicism is, above all, a practice of inner listening, and often it's only in that silent space that the truth appears. Without noise, without self-deception, without expectations, just clarity. And with clarity comes healing. A slow, solid, almost imperceptible healing, but real, deep, lasting. And when that happens, you realize it wasn't the talking that healed you. It was the pauses between the words. It was the space you gave your soul to breathe. But that is only possible for those who've learned to be silent. And maybe now, finally, you're ready to hear the rules that changed everything. Not every healing process needs a couch. Sometimes what truly transforms is a notebook, a silent early morning, and 3 ideas you choose to apply every day. That's what happened to me. 3 Stoic rules, simple but relentless, changed how I live. And as a result, changed how I suffer, because suffering still comes, yes, but it no longer drags me down. The first rule is, don't worry about what's beyond your control. It sounds trivial, but it's revolutionary. When you stop trying to control the uncontrollable, you free up energy to focus on what really matters, yourself. The second rule was even harder to accept. The world owes you nothing. Harsh, right? But liberating. This one pulled me out of the victim role. It made me stop blaming the past, others, or fate. Stoic philosophy doesn't offer comfort. It offers a mirror. And in that mirror, I saw how much I was still clinging to unrealistic expectations about others, life, and myself. When I let go of that, it was like breathing after years of holding my breath. I learned to deal with anxiety, frustration, fear, because I no longer expected the world to be fair. I expected only virtue from myself. The third rule, perhaps the most powerful of all, is a question. Will this matter in 5 years? Whenever something throws me off balance, I take a deep breath and ask myself this. And most of the time, I realize I'm about to give absurd importance to something small, fleeting, irrelevant. This simple reflection has saved me from fights, anxieties, bad decisions, and no therapist taught me this. It was Seneca. It was Epictetus. It was Marcus Aurelius, with their teachings for life written centuries ago, yet so alive, so useful, so human. But if there's one thing these rules taught me above all, it's that the biggest mistake we make lies in the place we least look. Most of your emotional pain doesn't come from what others do, but from what you expected them to do. You expected support, and got silence. You expected care, and got distance. You expected recognition, and got indifference. And then you suffer, not because you were rejected, but because you projected something the other never promised to deliver. Stoicism teaches, with almost surgical clarity, every expectation is an emotional debt you create and demand from someone who didn't even know they owed it. This isn't abstract philosophy, it's practical liberation. Because when you understand this, you start lifting the weight off others' shoulders and finally begin to breathe lightly. Expecting too much from others is a disguised way of giving up your own autonomy. It's like saying, "My peace depends on how you treat me," and when you hand over that power, you inevitably end up frustrated. The Stoic doesn't do this. They offer their best but don't demand reciprocation. They understand that others are fighting invisible battles and almost nothing is personal. This emotional maturity, which Stoic philosophy cultivates as a virtue, transforms how you relate. You start to love without clinging, help without expecting medals, listen without wanting to change the other. And most importantly, you begin to live with less weight. That's where emotional liberation happens. Not because the world changed, but because you stopped trying to mold it to your expectations. The emotional control you sought doesn't come from understanding others, but from understanding how much you projected onto them. And once that realization hits, the suffering dissolves. The reprogramming of the mind begins. You grow stronger. You stop begging for affection. You stop suffering. Because finally, you realize you were hurting yourself by trying to demand something that was no one's responsibility but your own. And with that clarity, you're ready to dive into the introduction that ties all this together with brutal truth and a promise of transformation. The Stoic journey doesn't promise comfort. It promises clarity. It doesn't promise instant healing. It promises awareness. And maybe that's why it works so well, because it gives you back the starring role. It doesn't treat you as a patient. It treats you as responsible. As someone capable of standing up, organizing their thoughts, building a life that doesn't depend on external stimuli to make sense. Now that you've heard all this, I leave you with one question. What are you still expecting from others that only you can give yourself? Maybe the answer lies in silence. Maybe it's in starting a new routine today, or in letting go of old expectations. Maybe, finally, it's in stopping reacting and starting to choose. So if this video touched something in you, write in the comments. Today, I choose discipline over dependence. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep walking this path with us.